Hey, what's up, guys? I'm Galaxus. Thanks for tuning in for another Mythic Heroes video. Today, what we're going to do is take a look at the hero tier list update for December. Asura has put this up for us. We got to give a big shout out for him for taking the time to put this together, and we just really love the way that he designed it and put it together. You can see here that at the top of the list, we have Lucifer. He's coming in at a 9.4, and it goes all the way down the list, down to the bottom lowest rating hero. And so we're going to work our way on down the list. We're going to start out with Lucifer. He's a UR, and in the early game, which is 1 to 15 levels, chapter 1 to 15, he is coming in at a 9. And mid game, which is 16 to 25, he's coming in at a 9. And then he actually goes up to a 10 late game. And that's chapter 26 and above. All right. Now, Lucifer is 8.9 against bosses, and he gets a 10 rating player versus player. So, I mean, he's really making a difference there. He gets an overall rating of 9.4, and he has a requirement of a 400 weapon and a divinity level 15. Those are recommended. So if you can get that, he's really going to shine at that point. All right, so let's take a look now. And Nua is going to be the next hero on the list. She is coming in early game at a 9, mid game 9.5, and late game she's coming in at a 9. Starts to fall off a little bit there, but she is shining mid game 9.5. And she's really the highest rated hero for mid game. All right, now against bosses, she's coming in at 8.9. Player versus player, she's coming in at a 9, and that's giving her an overall rating of 9.1. And her recommended weapon and divinity is going to be 400 with divinity 15. All right, so now we're going to move on down. Cassandra has made it onto the list, guys, and she is an incredible healer. She's an SSR hero. Early game, she gets a rating of 8.5. Mid game, she's getting a 9. And late game, she is getting a 9 as well. So she kind of just goes up and stays solid there all the way into the late game. Against bosses, she's getting an 8.7. And player versus player, she gets a 9. She has an 8.8 overall rating, which makes her the third highest rated hero on this tier list. And her recommended weapon is 400 with divinity 13. So that's what you want to get with Cassandra to help make her shine. Tamamo no Mai, another SSR hero, coming in at 8.5 early game, 9 mid game, and late game she kind of starts falling off a little bit. She comes in at an 8. Boss up against bosses 8.8, and player versus player she's getting a 9. Overall rating 8.7, and her recommended weapon is 300 with a divinity level 15. So that is Tamamo no Mai. Going down to Izanami, another SSR hero, 8.5 early game. She's almost identical to Tamamo. 8.5 early game, 9 mid game, 8 late game, 8.5 against bosses, a little bit lower. And player versus player, she gets a 9, giving her an overall rating of 8.6. And 300 is her recommended weapon level, and divinity level 15 is what you want to get for her. All right, now we're going with GM, SSR hero, and early game GM gets an 8.5, mid game a 9, and like the other two that we just mentioned, falls off to an 8 at late game. All right, and up against bosses 8.4, a little bit less than Izanami, and player versus player, she gets a 9, or they get a 9, and 8.6 overall rating. 400 recommended weapon with a divinity level 15. So that's what you want to get for GM. All right, now we're going to go with Eden or Iden. She is an SSR hero, a great healer, and she comes in 8 early game and then starts to shine at a 9 mid game and falls off just a little bit to an 8.5 in late game. Up against bosses, she's getting an 8.3. Player versus player, she's getting a 9, giving her an overall rating of 8.6 and 300 weapon level with a level 15 divinity. What you want to get on her. Okay, now Susano. Susano is coming in at a 7.5 early game. All right, and then he actually starts to shine mid game with a 9, and then he goes back down a little bit to an 8 late game. So he kind of peaks mid game. Against bosses, he's a 9, and player versus player, he's a 9, giving him an 8.5 overall rating. Level 400 weapon with a divinity level 15 is recommended for him. Okay, here is Hela. She's made it onto the list. Another great healer. She is an SSR hero, 8.5 early game, 9 mid game, and 8.5 late game. So she kind of peaks again mid game and kind of starts to fall off a little bit late game. Not much though. So she's really a really great solid hero. She's an 8 against boss, 8.5 in player versus player mode, and giving her an 8.5 overall rating with a recommended weapon level of 300 and a divinity 13 for Hela. So that is what you want to do for her. Okay, Isit is a UR hero, and she comes in early game 8, mid game 8.5, and late game 8.5. So she kind of picks up and just kind of stays solid. You get an 8.9 against bosses, and she's getting 8.5 against player versus player. Overall rating is 8.5 and recommended weapon level 400 with a divinity 15 for her. Okay, now we're on to Typhon, another new hero. He is a UR tank, and this guy comes in with an 8 early game, and then he picks up to 8.5 mid game, but really starts to shine at a 9 late game. And up against bosses, he gets an 8. Player versus player, he's getting a 9, giving him an overall rating of 8.5 with a 400 weapon level and a divinity 15 recommended for Typhon. Okay, moving on to Flora. She's an SSR hero, and she's getting an 8 early game, 8.5 mid game, and 8.5 late game. So kind of gets strong and just stays strong, not super strong, but 8.5 is nice. 8.4 against bosses and 8.5 against player versus player. Gives her an overall rating of 8.4, and we just need to have a level 300 weapon with the divinity 15 for Flora. Okay, on to Artemis. Artemis, SSR hero. She's coming in at 7.5. Not the best early game. Mid game, she gets a little bit stronger at an 8, but really starts to shine with a 9 in the late game over chapter 26. Against bosses, she's a 9.2. She really kind of shines there. And against player versus player, 8.5. Gives her an 8.4 overall rating with a level 400 weapon and a divinity 15 recommended for her. All right, we're moving on to Athena. Athena is an SSR tank, and she comes in with an 8 early game, 8 mid game, and then she really starts to shine late game with a 9. Against bosses, not so good, 7.3. Player versus player, she's coming in at 8. Giving her overall rating of 8.1, and then a weapon requirement of 300 with a divinity level 15 is what's recommended for Athena. All right, we're moving on to Persephone. Persephone is SSR Mage, and she's coming in early game pretty weak at a level 6. Mid game 7.5, but then she incredibly starts to shine incredibly level or at chapter 26 in late game. She goes up to a 9. So super solid there. 8.5 against bosses, 9 against player versus player. Gives her an overall rating of 8, and weapon 300 with divinity 15 is what's recommended for Persephone. All right, on to Zeus. Zeus is an SSR hero. He comes in at 7 early game, 7.5 mid game, and goes up to 8 late game. Kind of just rises and stays strong as he goes along. 8.5 up against bosses, and he comes in at 9 against player versus player. Gives him an overall rating of 8, and he only needs a weapon level 200 with divinity 15 in order to go. Naga Kanya, SSR, she is coming in at 7 early game. Then she's coming in 8 mid game, but she really takes off as an excellent healer late game and comes in at a 9. 7.9 up against bosses, 8 against player versus player. Gives her a overall rating of 8 and 400 weapon requirement or recommended, and divinity level 15 recommended for Nakakanya. Okay, we're on to Medusa. Medusa is an SSR fighter. She is rated at 7 early game. Not super strong. Mid game she comes up to an 8, and then she stays at an 8 for late game. Kind of gets strong and just stays strong. Not the strongest, but definitely can hold her own. 8.1 against bosses and 8 in player versus player. 7.8 is her overall rating with a 400 weapon recommended and divinity 15 for Medusa. Okay, we're on to Thor, SSR tank, and he's rated 8 early game, 8 mid game, and sort of kind of falls off, 7.5 late game. Up against bosses, he's 7.5, and up against player versus player, he's rated an 8, 7.8 overall with a recommended level 300 weapon and divinity 15 for Thor. Okay, we're moving on to Cleopatra, SSR Mage. She comes in at 6 early game, 7.5 mid game, and 8 late game. So she kind of starts going up, but doesn't get super strong. 8.5 against bosses, but she comes in at a 9 player versus player, really pushing up there. 7.8 overall rating, 400 weapon level, and divinity 15 recommended for Cleopatra. Okay, Lilith is a UR hero. Pretty low on the list down here. She comes in at 6 early game, 8 mid game, and 8 late game. 7.8 against bosses, 8 against player versus player. 7.6 overall rating, and a level 400 weapon with divinity 15 is recommended for Lilith. Okay, we're moving on to Oberon. He's an SSR fighter coming in at 7 early game, 8 mid game, and 8 late game. 8 against the bosses and 7 player versus player. Not the best for him. 7.6 is his overall rating, and 400 weapon recommended with divinity 15 for Oberon. Okay, we're on to Hercules, SSR tank. He is coming in at 7 early game, 7.5 mid game, and 8 late game. So he kind of rises up, but just stays solid. 7.1 against bosses and a 7.5 in player versus player mode. 7.4 is his overall rating. We recommend him to have a 300 weapon with divinity 15. Okay, on to Hades, another SSR tank. He is coming in 8 early game, 7.5 mid game, and 7 late game. So he kind of starts strong, but then starts to fall off a little bit. And then you got a 7.4 against bosses, but then goes up to 8 against player versus player. 7.4 overall rating. And recommended weapon is a 300 with the divinity 15 for Hades. Okay, we got a couple more left, and then we'll wrap it up. Anubis is another SSR tank. He comes in 6 early game, 7 mid game, but actually jumps up to 8.5 late game. 7.1 against bosses and 8 against player versus player. Gives them an overall rating of 7.3. Recommended weapon there is 300 with the divinity 15 for Anubis. Dionysus is SSR support, and 5 is pretty low. It's coming in at a 5 early game, 6 mid game, but then jumps on up to 8 late game. So he really has a pretty big impact there. Where he shines is a 9.4 against bosses. This guy is the king of bosses. And then 7.5 player versus player. Given an overall rating of 7.2, and weapon recommended is 300 with the divinity level 13 for Dionysus. He definitely can help you in some modes. Gaia is an SSR tank. Gaia is coming in at 6 early game, 6 mid game, but jumps up to 9 late game. So that is a huge jump. 6.9 against bosses, but 8 against player versus player. 7.2 overall rating with a 300 weapon recommended and divinity level 15. Okay, we got a couple more here and we'll be done. Joan of Arc, second to the last, SSR support, and she is coming in at a 5 early game, 6 mid game, but jumps up to 8.5 late game. So that's pretty solid. Start to use her late game. 8.2 against bosses, 8 against player versus player, and 7.1 is her overall rating. Recommended to have a level 400 weapon with Divinity 15 for Joan of Arc. All right. And for our last hero on the list, Lubu, an SSR fighter, he comes in low at a 5 early game, 6 in the mid game, and a 7 late game. So he never really gets above 8. He just doesn't really shine very much at all, but he is still useful in some places. 7.7 against bosses and a 7 player versus player. He gets the lowest rating at 6.5. And weapon requirement would be, or recommendation would be 400 with divinity level 15. So that is it for Lubu. That's it for the whole entire list, guys. This was a really nice put together list. We definitely appreciate the updated list. And guys, I think it's pretty much time to wrap this up. If you guys haven't already gotten subscribed, I don't know what you're waiting for. Click the subscribe button, come back, check out some more videos, and we'll catch you guys next time. I'm out of here. Peace.